don't buy the wrong laptop. If you just want the best performance for your money, you're probably looking at the wrong laptop. This XPS 16 here costs over 3 grand, and this guy over here is 3 times less the price, yet performs better than this guy over here. You don't believe me? Well, please give me 10 minutes of your time, and I'll show you by the end of the video. Realize, oh shoot, it's time you actually get to know this guy here as well. This part of the video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly. Improve your CPU and GPU cooling with their Cryonaut thermal pastes, or the Cryonaut Extreme for the extreme overclockers. If you're on the Intel LGA 1700 platform, check out their contact frame that prevents CPU bending. And for the curious PC enthusiast, you might want to check out the WireView Pro. For all your high performance cooling solutions, check out Thermal Grizzly in the video description below. This cost, for me, just over £1,000 after tax. Before tax, it's less than 900, which is absolutely ridiculous compared to this 3 grand laptop, the bells and whistles from Dell. But there's a few intricacies that I'm going to show you in a minute. Let's take a look at the actual, design of the laptops and what's going on in here. Both of them 16-inch, as I mentioned before, but the design elements are a little bit different. The XPS has a much better build quality, it's got a much premium feel, it's got a higher end specs and features. As you can see, the design is a lot more minimalistic. There's a little bit, you're getting a bit more expensive laptop when looking at the XPS. The Inspiron, it's a little bit more basic, but it's a bit of a sleeper if you know what I mean. Both of them are Copilot Plus laptops. And when looking at the keyboards and trackpads, to be honest, the XPS 16, when I've tried to type the first experience on this XPS keyboard, is not very good. Because there's no spacing around the keyboard, I often found myself hitting wrong keys and so on. The layout is a lot better on the Inspiron 16 Plus, and I found the typing experience, I'm missing less keys, even though the keys are actually smaller compared to the other one. I'm enjoying this a bit more. Although the trackpad is hidden on the XPS. It's just somewhere in the middle here. You think you're gonna miss it somehow, or oh, where is the trackpad? But honestly, very naturally goes somewhere over there, and whenever you start to do or move your mouse, it's just there. It's haptic. It's absolutely lovely. It's one of the best Windows trackpads that I have tested because it is haptic. The Inspiron here has a hinged one, and it is a little bit, cheap, okay? It's not the worst, it's not the best, but if you want great tracking experience, get an external mouse, which is actually the case with both of them. I like that you have a physical buttons for all of your keyboard and screen brightness here. On the Inspiron 16, the XPS has this touchpad thing that is very nice and minimalistic, but I don't like it as much. When having Ctrl-Shift-Escape for your task manager, it's very awkward, or when pressing Alt F4 to close it, I have to press Alt function and F4. It feels like, did I press it or did I? See, it doesn't work. See, you can't go Alt F4 to close the tab. Ctrl W doesn't work either. In terms of colors, the Inspiron has a few and the Dell XPS has a few as well. I think these are one of the nicest ones. The Inspiron has a bit more blue kind of tint to it, and they've done a very good job in making it feel metallic because the paint is metallic, even though a lot of the materials are plastic that they've made of. The screen flex on the Inspiron is, on the XPS is not as bad. So you can see the wobbles. The Inspiron wobbles a lot more. Let's take a look at the specs side by side. Both of them are running the Intel Ultra chips. One of them Ultra 7 155H and the other one Ultra 9 185H. The XPS has the higher one and the Inspiron has the lower one. Both of them actually have 6P cores, 8E cores and 22 threads, plus 2 low power efficiency cores, which you're not actually going to see in Task Manager, I believe. But the XPS boosts to 5.1 gigahertz and the Inspiron only 4.8. Interestingly, on the RAM choice, the XPS has it soldered on and you can go up to 64 gigabytes. Now, when you go with the RTX 4060 version of the Inspiron 16, you actually can get a sold-in version of this, which I did. I had the 16 gigabyte and I upgraded it easily to 64 gigabytes. But the maximum one, you can actually go to 96 gigabytes. The cheaper one has better RAM compatibility, although the RAM speed is lower at 5200 megatransfers per second right now. whereas the XPS can go to 7,467. The power draw, again, on the Inspiron is a little bit higher than on the XPS. The XPS caps at 80 watts, even though the PL1 limit has been set to 115 watts. I'm never seeing the 115 watts drawn from the CPU at any time. It caps at 80 watts. The GPU is an RTX 4060 mobile on the Inspiron and RTX 4070 on the XPS. But that can be a very misleading fact, as you'll see in a minute in some of the benchmarks, because this cheaper guy actually beats the 4070 with the 4060. How is this possible? Just wait till the end of the video, you'll see. Both have the same iGPU and the same process node, which is a 7nm Intel 4 process node. I highly recommend checking out the latest pricing in the description below, because I've seen the Inspiron on a deal for a couple of $100 off, where it's only $999. I'm not sure if this is still out there, but if it is, then in all truth, I'm not sure if there is better $1,000 laptop that you can buy in terms of performance than this one, section below. And the XPS 16 as well. I can see $500 off of this one. So I'll leave some links in the description below, and let me know what the pricing is at the time when you're watching this and in your current local store, because sometimes it goes very cheap or very expensive, and I'd love to know that. Benchmarks and how fast are these? We're looking at Cinebench R24. And firstly, we're looking at the CPU performance, but also the best and the worst case scenario, whether the devices are plugged in or not plugged in. I've tested it plugged in, and you can see that the XPS 16 is a little bit faster in single core performance because it boosts to 5.1 gigahertz. That 300 megahertz extra is a little bit faster. The Inspiron is only 3% slower. The multi-core though is about 2.3% faster on the Inspiron, because we have a higher power draw, 93 watts compared to the 80 watts on the XPS. When looking at the 10-minute throttle test, that the Inspiron starts to throttle a little bit and is only 1.5% faster. In 30 minutes though, it is 1.6% faster. So in multi-core performance, the Intel Core Ultra 7 is faster than the Ultra 9 because of the chassis and cooling design and power delivery. When looking at the battery performance, unplugging these devices and seeing what's the maximum performance on battery, things get a little bit interesting, because now the XPS is a little bit lower and the device is only within margin of error. The Inspiron is only 1.9% slower, which really you can't tell the difference. The multi-core score here though is interestingly even bigger gap now, 3.5% faster. So when moving on battery, this Inspiron is performing absolutely amazing. So as you can see, when comparing XPS 16, the battery versus plugged in, we're losing about 1.9% in single core performance and about 3% in multi-core performance. The Inspiron actually loses less compared to plugged in and with power, about less than 1% in single core score and about 2% in multi-core score. So this is the worst case scenario on both of these devices, if you unplug it or have it plugged in. The good news is both of these actually have very similar performance, whether your device is plugged in or not plugged in. And when talking about plugging in, both of these devices come with 130 watt USB-C charger. The Inspiron, interestingly, has a power plug here as well, a barrel plug. And I'm wondering if you can get even more performance out when using this barrel plug there, and when we can accept, I don't know, 200 watts, maybe even more. The downside for the Inspiron is when you're using the USB-C for charging, you don't have any other USB-C ports to actually use on the laptop, which is a bit of a downer. Now the rest of the benchmarks are all plugged in, but now you know what the worst and best case scenario is in terms of plugging in or having it in battery power. Bear in mind, the actual applications, whether you're doing video editing, photo editing, something like that, you're not going to see it as drastic, because this was very intense CPU test. Unless you are using, Cinebench for some of your rendering. In photo editing applications, you're not going to see that big of a difference. Looking at Geekbench 6, you can see that the Inspiron is 0.6% slower in the single core and about 0.5% slower in the multi-core score, which is not that big of a difference at all. Moving on to Geekbench for Photoshop, you can see that the Inspiron 16 Plus is only about 1.7% slower in the overall scores. 1-2% is within margin of error, but I do have to mention that I have upgraded the RAM on the Inspiron 16. I put 64 gigabytes in, and that will give you quite a big difference in some of these applications. And in real world, the actual difference is even bigger because the benchmarks don't utilize the RAM as much because they're very, very efficient in that. But in your actual workflow, when you're working with video or photos, the RAM is very, very important. So my advice to you is, even when you're getting the XPS 16, please upgrade your RAM to the maximum you can afford to 64 gigabytes if possible, because your device just will last longer because you can't upgrade it there. Good job is with the Inspiron, you can upgrade it later, but with the XPS 16, you can't. So make the good RAM choice first. So in this case, in these benchmarks, the XPS has actually 32 gigabytes and the Inspiron has 64 gigabytes of RAM. Looking at Lightroom Classic, the Inspiron now is faster. About 7.5% faster, which is quite a marginal amount, and the passive score is about 12% faster. It could be down to some of the performance given from the RAM because of the double capacity, but still looks like it is better. Probably because we have better power delivery and the multi-core performance is better. So interestingly, the cheap device can be faster. Looking at the video editing performance, again, we're seeing similar thing. The Inspiron is about 3.7% faster in the extended overall scores and about 1.5% faster in the standard overall scores. Now, I believe some of this is due to more RAM. So take, a couple of percent off, they're performing about the same. Interestingly, the long GOP for some reason is slower on the Inspiron 16 Plus, about 6.6%. Now, because the iGPU VRAM, when it uses decode, for example, is also locked or influenced by the RAM speed. So the faster your RAM is, the kind of faster your iGPU VRAM is, if that makes sense. I think it's because we have the SODIMM is not as fast as on the XPS. That's why the XPS long GOP score is better, because it just has faster RAM for that, media acceleration hardware playback. But interestingly, on the intraframe standard, the Inspiron 16 Plus is 30% slower. I double checked it and I went back, so have I made a mistake? For some reason, it is that much slower. I don't know why. Moving on to After Effects. Both of these devices are very, very similar. As you can see, we can say that they're within margin of error, 1.5% faster. That doesn't really make any difference. So, I'd say both of these devices perform the same. I think Inspiron 16 has a bit of an edge because it has more RAM, because After Effects would love to use more RAM. Now, Geekbench for DaVinci Resolve Studio and the free version actually. So the basic score, what you can see here, is actually on the DaVinci free version. And then the standard overall score is the studio version. Unfortunately, the XPS 16 just doesn't complete the benchmark with the extended overall score. That's why you're not going to see that there. It doesn't mean that it can't do it, but I think there's some kind of an error with maybe the RAM support or capacity. That's why it crashes in there. But the Inspiron actually, completes all of the benchmarks. And you can see that we're about 3.4 to 5.7% faster in the overall scores. The GPU effects and raw scores are a little bit slower, but Fusion again is about 14.3% faster. And this could be because of the RAM capacity. So again, the Inspiron is faster. But now things get interesting because we're going to look at 3D rendering performance on CPU and GPU. Firstly, looking at Blender, the Inspiron 16 is 1.9% faster in the monster scene, about 2.5% slower in the juke shop scene, and about 4% faster in the classroom scene on the CPU, which is interesting. Our cheaper device kind of outperforms the more expensive device. Now looking at the GPU rendering, monster scene on GPU is only 1.5% slower on the Inspiron 16 Plus with RTX 4060 compared to the 4070. The junk shop scene is 8.9% faster on the 4060 compared to the 4070, and the classroom scene is about the same, 0.6% slower on the 4060. What's going on? Just wait, you'll see. Looking at V-Ray, the CPU score is about 5.67% faster on the Inspiron. The CUDA score with 4060 is 14.4% faster compared to the XPS 16. The RTX score is 15.5% faster on the 4060 compared to the 4070. You think I've messed up some kind of benchmarks here? No, I've done it multiple times. These are the right ones. I'll tell you in a minute what's going on. Looking at Octanebench, the 4060 actually is within margin of error to the 4070. Again, looking amazing. And finally, the Redshift performance. Looking at the plugged-in performance, the 4060 is about 2% slower. In 10 minutes, we're actually only 0.5% slower because both of these devices start to throttle, but the XPS seems to be throttling a little bit more compared to the Inspiron 16 Plus. And then in 30 minutes, we're about 1.7% slower compared to the XPS. On battery, the Inspiron 16 Plus doesn't push as much power through the GPU, and we're about 4.3% slower. So what is going on with the GPU performance? It's actually a very simple answer. The 4060 gets more power delivered to the GPU compared to the 4070. Even though the 4070 has more cores, probably higher clock speeds, the power draw, what I can see on the 4070 is about 50 watts. And on battery, about 45. But the Inspiron 16, I can see about 60 watts being pulled and about 50 watts on battery, which is more power to the GPU. And that's why the 4060 can basically match the performance of the 4070 because the 4070 is starved of power. So don't fall for this marketing trick. Sometimes the lower end GPU is better than the higher end one. Who would have known? I'm just testing the speakers. So in terms of speaker quality, the XPS obviously wins quite a bit. When doing the testing side by side, I can actually hear that the XPS goes quite a bit louder. There's quite a bit more bass, quite a bit more clarity. One thing when seeing different songs here is you might not want to listen to it at full blast or full volume because I can hear some rattling in there on both of these devices. Turn it slightly down and you'll get the best experience. When looking at the screens side by side, there is one obvious winner, which is the XPS. It's got an OLED panel, it's a touch screen, it is just absolutely gorgeous to look at. It goes brighter, it's got better colors, 10-bit. For creators, there is no actual comparison. The only thing that the Inspiron does better is the hertz. It's got 120 hertz panel compared to the 90 hertz on the XPS. So that's the only thing different. But at that price point, you can't really complain about the screen. And lastly, we're going to compare the ports. When looking at the right side of the device, the Inspiron 16 has a micro SD card slot, the same as the XPS. We have a headphone and mic combo jack and two 5 gigabit USB Type A ports. Whereas on the XPS, only USB Type-C, which is 10 gigabits in speed, and then a headphone mic combo jack. Interestingly, the XPS 16 doesn't have any USB Type-A ports. You're going to have to use the dongle that comes with it. But on the left side, we have the power plug for the Inspiron, HDMI port, one Thunderbolt 4 port, but the XPS has just two USB Type-C ports. But it does come with this dongle, USB Type-C to HDMI and Type A, that you can use this if you are presenting or something like that. Even though the Inspiron 16 has more USB Type A ports, I've got to give an edge to the XPS just because the charger is USB Type C, and when using the device, I've had some USB-C either SSDs or other devices that plug in USB Type-C, and then the Inspiron, when plugged in, I just can't use any of them, whereas on the Dell, I have a few more USB-C ports to choose from. One thing I do have to criticize on both of these laptops is the SD card slot. I think the micro SD card slot just at 16-inch form factor is not okay. It needs to be full size, especially when targeting this as creators, because the micro SD card you can always convert to the normal SD card size, but it doesn't work vice versa. Now, if you're at this point of the video, you have realized that the Inspiron 16 is actually very, very impressive device. It packs so much power and actually, in a lot of the cases, outperforms the a lot more expensive XPS 16. The build quality is a little bit lower, the screen is not as nice, and some of the usability features aren't as nice on the Inspiron. But if you're looking for a budget laptop that just performs absolutely amazing,
then the Inspiron 16 is the one for you. Now, the XPS is a beautiful laptop. You can feel that it's very well engineered. Build quality is amazing. It's a lot more robust, higher quality build quality. I've said build quality a lot of times now, but it is a lot better in every single way. What we can see Dell has done on the XPS is actually created a device that doesn't lose that much performance, whether plugged in or not plugged in, and give you kind of just ultimate unplugged performance. But I feel like this is a compromise, because if an Inspiron 16 can match the unplugged performance and get even more when plugged in, but the screen and the keyboard and trackpad, they're one of the best on the market. So if you're looking for that, the XPS 16 is the best one for you. One thing I have noticed when carrying this around, the XPS is very, very heavy. They've put a lot of metal into there, and this is not as heavy as this guy over here. It's seriously heavy. If you want to see the teardown and what's inside, go check out my previous video about the unboxing and a little bit more when we're testing some of the things like thermals and so on. Go check that one out. But my question to you is, which one would you get? And if you're getting one of these, check out the links in the description below. Thanks guys for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.